Yep, great. Okay. So welcome to one of our lectures in our AFP series. The deadline for obviously applying for the AFP is coming soon, and the interviews are in less than a month's time. So what we've got today is a lecture just about applying to the AFP once again, providing you with information about all the aspects of the AFP. And to do that, we've got two foundation doctors who are currently undertaking the academic foundation program in the Northwest as well. And just a bit of housekeeping, this lecture is being recorded, so you can refer back to it later. We're also going to be distributing the slides after lecture 2. And then the last thing is that we will be handing out a feedback form, and upon completion of that within a few days, we will send you the slides as well as a certificate of attendance as well. So without further ado, I'm going to mute myself and hand over to Dr. Samir and Udaya.
Okay, hi guys. So as he mentioned, we're both AFP doctors. We both work at MRI in our first year of our AFP training. This will hopefully be the first of maybe a 2 or 3 part series. So before the application, it's about the application process itself, and before the interview, more about the critical appraisal part of it and the clinical scenario. Any questions, you can just shout out or just type in the chat and try and keep an eye on it, okay? So if you want to move on to the next slide, Yasmin. Okay. So the general format is going to be a sort of overview, sort of bird's eye point of view of the application process itself. And then Yasmin will talk about educational achievements, that's like papers and posters. And then white space questions will be me. And then in between that, sort of maximizing points in both of those fields. And then hopefully a small Q&A session at the end to answer any questions. But as I mentioned, any questions throughout, just sort of shout out or put your hand up on the chat process, and then we'll answer the questions. So next slide. Okay, so I'm not going to labor this point too much. I'm sure you guys all know this. So about a week and a half from now will be the application deadline. I mention this because every year, some people do miss this. I know someone at UCL who also missed this. He's a really smart guy. So please keep an eye on that, 4th November at 12. And then it really varies depending on where you're applying to. So for the Northwest, which is where we're obviously training at the moment, the 16th of November will be the shortlisting outcome. So you can email, and then Oriel will tell you that you've either been accepted or not been accepted. In general, a lot of people tend to get interviews at Manchester. They interview a lot of people, so you've got a high chance. And then after that, you get the interview notification, and it's via Microsoft Teams this year, which has advantages and disadvantages. And then beyond that, you get offers in 13th of January, and then cascade offers later on if you weren't successful the first time round. Okay, next slide. So I've kind of alluded to this. So there are 2 stages to this application process. The first step is online application, and that includes where you're listing all your papers, publications, posters, all that you've achieved, and white space questions. White space questions, by the way, are a really good determinant and discriminant because a lot of people are in a very similar boat in terms of how many papers they have or publications. And then interviews later on. And this year, I think because of COVID, decile ranking and EPM scores aren't factored in at all. So that's that. And then the next slide is basically to say that the SJT, it doesn't count towards the application process itself in terms of points, but you must have a satisfactory performance for a place on the course. And from what I understand, you should have performed equally or better than the lowest scoring candidate or successfully placed FP doctor. So you have to get roughly around like 30. It's not a lot, but I would really give this its due diligence. The reason being is that no one's guaranteed a place on the AFP course. And if you don't get the AFP, you can still do research. But doing research is easier at a teaching hospital, and they tend to be more competitive. So you tend to require around 85-ish points to get in. So doing well on the SJT just really secures that. So if you don't get in, it's not the end of the world. Just make sure you have at least 85 points. You can get into a good hospital and do research regardless. So give it its due diligence. Don't ignore it. And it's around November, I think December time for you guys. So we do give it its due diligence, but it's not counted at all towards the AFP, as opposed to obviously the FP, where it's 50% of the application process itself. Next one.
Yeah, so just an overview of the sections of the application. It shouldn't have changed too much from last year. Everything's pretty straightforward, but the bits we're really interested here is the evidence of selection criteria, which is your educational achievements, and the supporting information, which is the white space questions. In terms of references, they'll be collected against your normal foundation program application. And you can update your referees if you change your mind at a later date. Most people tend to use their PPD tutor. Just pick someone who's quite reliable and isn't going to be away for the first few months of next year. I remember, I think my reference was completed in about March time, so just be aware of that. In terms of the breakdown of point allocation, I'm sure you guys have already seen this, but for the Northwest, the maximum score for the educational achievements is 41 for the degrees, presentations, posters, publications, and academic prizes. And then your white space questions are 25 points, 5 points for the first question, and then 10 for the other two. What I would say is don't stress about the educational achievements, because if you've got them, you've got them. If you don't, you don't. There's nothing you can do about it now. What you can make a big difference on now is the white space questions. So fill out the rest of your application and then spend time perfecting the questions. I'm just going to go through the educational achievement section quite quickly. Don't want to patronise anyone, because they have made it really clear this year actually what counts, and it's quite straightforward. So looking at degrees, again, quite straightforward. You don't need any evidence for additional degrees within the AFP application. They're already provided in the normal foundation application. You just put in your degree certificate. As far as I'm aware from last year, the way the assessment process works is they have a meeting with a number of assessors who are each allocated to look at different areas of the application. So some, for example, will have a look at oral presentations, some white space question 1. They don't necessarily have a medical background. I remember Alison from the undergrad team at MRI used to take part in the assessment process. Not sure entirely how it'll work this year with COVID, but just to bear that in mind. In terms of the oral presentation, again, it's quite clear what counts. Just what I would say is make it clear to the review panel in the headings that this was regional, national, international. Just make it clear so they count the points that you deserve. Yeah, I know I'm going through this quite quickly, but if we have any questions at the end, then just feel free to let one of us know. Poster presentations, again, make sure in the heading clearly that it says whether it's international, national, regional. Student conferences aren't explicitly excluded. I was having a look through the AFP handbook criteria. So do include them, and they might actually score you quite a few points if it's an international student conference or a national student conference. So on the actual application itself, I'm sure you've all had a look, unless it's changed a lot from last year, which I don't think so. Sort of looks like this. If the application hasn't changed, the presentations are grouped in the same section, but you need to specify which are oral, which are posters, and that could because they're scored separately like we saw earlier. It does say list all the authors in the same order as the evidence, but you don't need to provide evidence for presentations, so don't worry about that bit. I remember it caused quite a bit of confusion when we were applying. Okay. So prizes. Distinctions at medical school used to count, but unfortunately this year not anymore. And what I would say with prizes is, if your academic prize was worth over £100, make it obvious and write the value of the prize. That will automatically give you 4 points. Whereas if you don't put the value, they might only score you 2 points, for example. Realistically, I think most people will score a maximum of 3 or 4. So don't let the 10-point international competitive prize scare you. Publication-wise, do put in case reports. So it is classed as non-research, but they would give you 2 points. They would only give you a maximum of 2 points no matter what journal it is, no matter the impact factor. Abstracts, researched abstract are counted, and they would give you 4 points. If you've had an abstract published, please make sure you include it because it will count. And I've just highlighted here, do make sure you list all the authors in the same order as in the evidence, and put your name in capitals just to make it really obvious whether you're first, second author, etc. Okay, so I've just put here, don't include things that are definitely not going to score you any points. So for example, for posters, if you're not a first, second or last author, even if it is an international conference, for example, it's not going to give you any points. Don't put it on there. If you're on the fence though about a particular educational achievement, I would say just add it. If they count it, great. If not, then it doesn't disadvantage you in any way. So just put it on there. Everything that you feel meets the criteria, even if there's something that scores higher, put it on there, because if something isn't counted for whatever reason, then at least you have other things that might score you points. So in terms of evidence, just if you're applying to somewhere other than the Northwest, check specific deanery requirements. But for the Northwest, you only need evidence of publications, and that has to be a PubMed ID. So the only publications obviously that count are the PubMed index ones. Please make sure you check and check and check that the PubMed ID works, put it into PubMed, make sure it links directly to the publication with your name visible. Otherwise, they will not count it, and you can't edit it after the application, and you'll lose out on those points. And it's a real shame. So anything else other than publications, you don't need to provide any evidence for. You just have to submit an oral probity declaration at the end of the application, and you know, they're just going to have to take your word for it that you've done those things. So kind of what Harith was saying earlier, it's not necessary to have publications for a successful application. Lots of applicants have secured a place on the program without publications. I would say just use it to your advantage in interviews and things, and say that you'd like to use the AFP to pursue publication and generate those skills. And people will kind of empathize with that, because everyone's been through it. Everyone's had things rejected from papers.
Okay, so focusing more on the white space questions. So as I alluded to, and Yasmin alluded to, it's really important in shortlisting candidates. So people do score very similarly across the cohort, and so it's a really useful discriminator. So with a week and a half left, this should be the thing that you're really focusing on over the next few days. It does require many drafts and get feedback from as many people as possible. Now, ideally, there should be a senior researcher or a consultant with some experience of competitive academic applications, and also quite usefully, someone who's an AFP currently or someone who recently completed the AFP, because they've got first-hand experience of the process itself. Now, one thing that you need to sell yourself. So it's quite difficult and we're not very good at it, but you've got to really sell yourself. Really explicitly say what you achieved, whether that be an international conference or national conference, you got publication, you got an oral presentation, whatever it may be, but really just put everything down there, because like Yasmin said, those who actually mark the white space questions don't have access to your actual education achievement section. So they don't know if you presented or published anywhere. One more thing is answering the question. So a lot of people don't really answer the full question. So you could write a fantastic paragraph about how amazing you are, but if it doesn't answer the question explicitly, you won't get marks. And also they tend to have two parts to it. So one is, for example, demonstrate that you're good at leadership or teamwork. And the second part is actually linking that back to the AFP. So make sure you get both parts, because there are obviously marks allocated to both sections. And also, I think being very clear and logical, it makes it easier for the examiner and for you, because they've got so many to read and they read through things very quickly, unfortunately. So you want to make sure that it's very clear. Same with OSCEs, you know, so they have a checkbox of things to tick off. If you make it very clear for them, it makes it easier for them to give you the marks, and they want to give you the marks. Also being concise. So often at some deaneries, they don't say how many examples to give. So it's like, just give me examples of teamwork. I would say limit it to 1 or 2 examples. I personally recommend using 1 example. So because the point here is to elaborate as much as possible. So the foundation school actually say that it's scored in the quality of example and the depth, not by how many you give. So you can give 6 examples of how good you are, but actually the point here is not really the description, but more the explanation, the skills and the qualities you demonstrated, the insights you gained, the things that you learned in the process. And a useful tip also is to try to identify the person specification that they have published online, and try and highlight how you in your answers match that person's specification. And similarly, on a similar theme, always try and link your answers to the broader academic pathway. So not just focusing on AFP and how important that is, but actually taking a step back and how this is important for you as a platform to then go on to the ACF and clinical lectureship and professorship. So the bigger and the broader picture. and demonstrating your commitment to pursuing an academic route in medicine. Because if you do that, you're a safer candidate. So if you have two people and one's like, oh, I'm not really certain, and others like, actually, I'm really committed to academia, you don't have to be, it's not really true. I mean, you know, it's not necessarily true, but if you show that, you're a safer candidate for them to choose. So try and do that. So linking it to the person's specification and linking it to the academic pathway are really, really useful tips. Next slide. So I'm not going to read these out. So these are the questions specifically for the Northwest. And you can see that the first one is about research, med ed, or leadership. And again, the second point here, significance to your application to the academic foundation program. Both things are really, really important. Second question is about teamwork. So being a leader and a team worker. And again, it's about explaining the significance of this experience to your application to the AFP. And the third one's about future career aspirations. And they're split into 5 points, 10 and 10. I will give equal amount of effort to each question because ultimately you want to score the maximum number of points. But just bear in mind that there are more points allocated to the lower two questions as opposed to the first question. So in terms of how to approach, I think there are two quite useful frameworks that you can use, and they're both quite complementary actually. So the first one is a sandwich approach. Okay, so basically what you do here is that you want to sandwich the bulk of the answer around a really punchy opening, and that opening should ideally incorporate some wording of the question, so paraphrase the question. And that's really useful to signpost the examiner that you're actually tackling the question directly. And then you have your meat, and we'll talk about that later. And then you have a really punchy ending. And that is about translating this into how it makes you a better or more suitable AFP candidate and how important those skills are as an AFP doctor. And then that actual meat part, so the middle part, you can use a STAR approach. And in the STAR approach, I'm sure you know, it's the situation, the task. And in the task, you want to really highlight the challenges, constraints, deadlines in the action. So what you actually did, how you tackled that initiative, how you were proactive, how you're quite insightful, how you got around that particular problem, and then the results. So what you actually achieved and any outcomes or outputs from that. So using the sandwich approach, beginning, so really openly, punchy line, really quite a nice ending where you're linking back to the AFP and the person specification. And in the middle, you have that STAR approach where you're really going into detail about what you actually achieved from that particular experience. Okay, so for the first question, so this is about your academic, teaching or leadership experience. So pick one example. It does explicitly say that pick one example that shows you up to your best potential. Okay, so something that will show that will actually allow you to demonstrate a variety of skills. So it doesn't matter what AFP you're going into, so research or med ed or leadership, and choose any of the above and focus on that depending on what you've been involved in, but ideally related to the AFP that you want to go into, because that makes it easy for you to discuss during the interview, and they do that. Give really clear specifics. So what exactly was your role? What was your personal contribution? What do you actually do in that particular project? And name any particular outcomes that you achieved from that. And it's really important to be very clear in highlighting what you actually did and what the outputs were from that. So papers, prizes, conferences, skills. And it's really important because they don't have access to that other part of your application, like I mentioned earlier. And again, the bulk of the answer should be used to highlight any translational skills that you gained from that. So reflecting the lessons that you learned, and again, conclude with a statement about the direct relevance of that experience to the AFP and to you as an AFP doctor, and leading on to the ACF and so on. Now, a good thing to use if you intercalate it, which most of you probably would have done, is use your BSc year or your master's year, because you can really highlight how you're able to develop research skills, academic writing for your thesis or for any papers, presentation skills as part of your examination or as part of academic writing. And then you can really go into what you actually did in that project and all your self-directed work and all your achievements there. So that's for the first question. So the second question, if you move on to the next slide, is about teamwork. And this can be any example. It doesn't have to be restricted to academic role. It can be anything, so extracurricular or likewise. And again, you want to clearly define your role within the team. And you want to show that you are able to act as a leader and as a team member, that you understand the dynamics of the team and how to harness the full potential of team members, how you were able to achieve predefined success. So you set out measures at the beginning, And then you took initiative and you took very clear steps as a team. And as a leader, you demonstrated that proactive, results-driven plan to achieve that particular outcome. And although you are results-driven, you also have the softer skills, so distributed leadership. So you're respectful of others, you're a good listener, you're focused on the team's overall goals, as opposed to, being very driven yourself by your individual aims and targets. And again, sort of demonstrating translational skills and the relevance of this particular experience to the AFP program. Because as an AFP doctor, you have your clinical team where you're more of a team player. You have your research where you may be more of a leader if you're leading that particular research, and you have medical students. So when you're teaching medical students, again, you're a leader, you're a role model. I think a useful tip would be to talk about an experience where you've had to deal with pressure. So any sort of pressure situation, any problem or issue, and being able to prioritize tasks and deal with pressure, because they're both components of being a good foundation program doctor or AFP doctor, and they're part of the person specifications. It's a nice way of linking both things together. And then for the last part, so this is really weird because as a final year medical student, I'm not sure how you're expected to know exactly what you want to go into, but this is really trying to see how committed you are to academic medicine. So I wrote about ophthalmology, but actually I've changed my mind about it. But I think the key thing is showing that you're passionate about something, that be hematology or whatever that may be. What do you do to demonstrate that passion? So do you do any conferences? Do you do some research in that particular area? Do you join a charity that talks about or tackles that particular issue? So for example, blindness in young people, if you're doing ophthalmology, and then sort of linking that to what happens after the AFP. So yes, you get onto the AFP. Yes, you want to do a project on that particular specialty, just say that. So for example, you can say, I talked to this professor and we discussed this particular project of interest on ophthalmology. That sounds really interesting. And from there, I want to go and do a master's, for example. I want to go into the ACF. I want to pursue a very academic route in medicine and then go on to be a senior lecturer and have become a professor in ophthalmology or hematology or whatever it may be. So I think the fundamental thing here is you don't have to be committed to a particular specialty, but the key thing is showing some passion about it, demonstrating how you demonstrate that particular passion. So whatever you did in that, so research or conference, like I mentioned, but really the critical thing here is about linking that to the overall broader picture of academic medicine and that clinical sort of that pathway that you follow in terms of the AFP, the ACF, the senior lecturer, the clinical lecturership position, the professorship, and so on and so forth, and the PhD, of course, within that. So demonstrating that you are someone who's very academically driven and that you are someone who wants to follow a very academic and strict academic route in medicine. And that will hopefully allow you to get the maximum number of marks on this particular question. And then just a few other things to consider. I think it's really more important for the interview, but basically, if you are able to contact someone in that particular department, let's say, for example, you're interested in becoming a GP and you contact the professor of GP who leads that particular AFP stream, that's really good. So you can say that I contacted Professor Ismail, for example, and we discussed a particular project on this. That sounds really interesting. It shows how committed you are to this particular AFP program at Manchester or wherever you're applying. And it's being aware of the added pressure of being an academic doctor, because you have obviously all your foundation competencies along with all your academic competencies, and showing that you're someone who can prioritize and juggle different balance things together quite nicely. And that's sort of really important for the interviews, especially the personal interview where they discuss, you yourself, how you tackle difficult situations, how do you think you can balance all of these things together. Just thinking about that in the back of your mind. But I think the first point is really critical. If you are able to contact someone now or before the interview and discuss some projects, it could be anything, it doesn't have to be very concrete or specific, but it's showing that you had that initiative and that proactive approach that really put you in good standing for the AFP, especially for the interview. And yeah, there's no right way to do this. So, just be honest, sell yourself, show that you're passionate, that you have a lot of dreams that you want to achieve in medicine, and that will hopefully allow you to shine through and do really well in that.
Just to add, we didn't really think it would be appropriate to put examples of white space questions up, because I feel like it would just make everyone more confused. It's quite stressful comparing your answers to other people, and everyone's application is really, really unique. So I feel like as long as you follow, the tips that we've kind of given in this presentation, you'll do fine, and your white space questions will be amazing. Just a little bit about preferences. List all the tracks you'd like to be considered for. So essentially in the preference section, you'll just list all the ones you're interested in and leave all the ones that you're not. It won't disadvantage you in getting your top preference, so just put as many as you're willing to actually do on there. If possible, you can ask F1s currently doing those tracks what the jobs are like, so you know what to expect. If you have a number of extremely busy jobs, will you realistically be able to achieve any of your academic goals on top of this? In busy jobs, you will have to come in on your days off, come in early or stay late to get anything done. And that is throughout your academic career in the NHS, not just in your foundation years. So do bear that in mind. So just a little bit about the interview. Harith already said it's on the 26th of November this year, Microsoft Teams. You'll have the same 2 panelists for the entire interview rather than moving between interviews is what they did last year. Again, it will be 3 stations: the personal interview station, the stats or critical appraisal station, and then the medical knowledge station. And you'll actually only be notified of the shortlisting outcome 10 days prior to the interview date. So you know whether you have an interview 10 days before. Essentially, that's only a month from now. So start your prep ASAP. You can't afford to wait for the outcome. I think Harith actually already said this, but for the Northwest, I feel like it's relatively easy to secure an interview. I don't personally know a single person who's applied to the Northwest AFP who hasn't had an interview. And throughout the application, you'll just get little email alerts and updates when you submit your application, when you get your interview, when you get any new offers, whether you've accepted your offer, etc. So just keep an eye out for those. If you do get an offer and you accept your offer, then you'll automatically be withdrawn from the normal foundation program. Don't be alarmed if you accept your offer and then get an email straight after that saying application withdrawn. It's just the normal foundation program. I thought I'd accidentally rejected mine at the time. So I think Harith also talked about this earlier. If you're not successful, don't worry. AFP is definitely not the only route into academic medicine. The only difference between normal FP and academic FP is that you'll have some dedicated time to research, which is good, plus a few extra teaching sessions here and there. AFPs really vary, but the academic block is often in F2 after applications for specialty training are due. So you can't rely on your academic time to bulk up your CV. It has to be done in your own time during F1 anyway. So I just wanted to give an example here. So if you're thinking about academic clinical fellowship after foundation years, and you look at their academic person specification, all the essential and most of the desirable qualities as well can be achieved as a normal trainee. You just need to be keen and committed. I personally know a current ACF who didn't do an AFP, and it hasn't made a difference at all in, to his career goals and involvement in academia. So don't worry, it's not the be all and end all of research. Just wanted to finish off by saying good luck, and if anyone has any questions, we're happy to take them either in the chat or verbally as well.
I think there are a few questions in the chat.
I can't see because of my screen.
Yeah, so for question 1 of the white space, can you use non-medicine experiences, roles as examples? So I think for the research one, it's easier to use something that you've done in medicine. It makes more sense. But for leadership, definitely, and for med ed, definitely you can use roles outside of medicine. But I think if you're doing research, and I think the majority will do research, it is easier to use roles or to use experience that you achieved during medicine itself because you had more opportunities. But if you have anything outside that, it doesn't harm you at all. If I think for the teamwork, it's actually advisable actually to give a nice sort of extracurricular experience of teamwork. So don't feel restricted to giving sort of roles within medicine itself. Another one is for the clinical station. For the clinical station, is this based on one clinical scenario, A&E assessment, or is it more like an oral Q&A exam? So when we had it, so we had one long sort of scenario, and the diagnosis, I think in the end, was pancreatitis. But they were kind of taking you through the whole experience, how you would manage that. I think it varies. So in London, you have sort of 3 clinical scenarios in prioritization. But when we had it in Manchester, it's one sort of long brief. And then you have 3 examiners. Well, I had 3 examiners, and they would basically just grill you on how you manage a patient, go through a full detail A to E, and how you tackle that particular scenario. So for Manchester, it's one long sort of brief, like a vignette, and then you go through that in detail with the examiners, and they kind of will grill you down and try and find out how much you know about how managing sort of someone who's acutely unwell. So you can't, you don't really specify. So you tend to apply for, so it depends where you apply to. So I know some places like Bolton, for example, they only have, I think, med ed. So when you apply to, for example, let's say MRI is your first choice, you don't specify MRI leadership, just MRI as general. And then within that, you do your own project. So it's very much open. So you basically sort out your own project, you email whoever you want to, and you go from there. So you don't specify, I want to go to MRI for leadership. You say, I want to go to MRI. And then within MRI, you apply to, or you contact whoever you want to apply to and do that particular project with. It's not specific. It's not as specific as other places. It's very much open like Oxford. Other questions? So I think they've changed the scenario this year to clinical and career aspirations. What do you think may come up for the 15-minute career aspiration station? So in my personal interview, so we had personal, academic and clinical. So for my personal one, it was about my white space questions and how I want to incorporate research into my career long term. So it's very much about, I guess it is very much about your career aspirations. And again, you don't have to be fixated on doing a particular specialty. I think it's more about demonstrating your passion or your enthusiasm for academic medicine. So talking about, having a very sound understanding of the whole process, so AFP onto ACF, onto your PhD, onto your clinical lectureship and professorship. I think that's really important. So I think they will expand more on your career and your commitment to academic medicine. So definitely having a very solid understanding of that would be very useful. So again, at interview, do they know what programs you ranked in what order? No, they don't. At the interview, had they read your white space questions? Yes, and they can use that as a platform to ask you questions. So make sure you're very well clued up on that. I think that's the majority of the questions.
I'm answering a few in the chat as well.
Okay. Are there any other questions that you guys want to just shout out, or that would
There was one more asking about whether you could clarify what you meant by a researched abstract.
Yes, essentially, I've just replied to that one. So it means something where you've submitted an abstract based on your own research. So, for example, a case report wouldn't count because that isn't research. Yeah, does that just pop a message in the chat, Annabelle, if that answers your question?
Someone wants to ask a question verbally, but the host has disabled the function.
That should be fixed now, sorry.
Hi, how are you? Thanks for the session, firstly. Just one question I had. Will we get recordings of the previous sessions that you've done on the AFPs? So that
we haven't done any previous ones yet. This is the first one that we've done.
Wasn't there statistics one done last week? Or no?
So I think that's probably directed to us as the society. We haven't done the stats one just yet, actually. We did one last year, but we'll be doing another one in a week's time.
Okay, so this is the first one this year?
Yeah.
All right, okay, that's fine then. Also, one more thing. Other than the Northwest, are there any other foundation schools where getting to AFP is probably less competitive, like you recommend as a second degree to apply to?
I don't personally. So you can look at the statistics. I think there are stats published online. I think the North, as in like the North, like Newcastle and stuff, is less competitive. But I think generally speaking, all AFPs are kind of competitive. There are obviously like London's probably the most competitive, and then filtering it down. So I think just pick where you want to personally go, and I would advise picking not based on location, but picking more on the AFP that suits you best. let's say, for example, you're really into cardiology and a specific subset of cardiology, and
Yeah.
let's say York does that program, it may not be the best place to live in the world, but pick that because of that particular program. So pick a program as opposed to a location, and then just go
Right.
for it.
Okay.
Because ultimately, anywhere you apply to will be competitive. So just pick somewhere where you'd be happy to sort of be there and do that particular AFP.
Right. Okay. So program is more important than location. Right. Okay. And
So
one
for
more
that,
thing. So based on the type of AFP, like whether you want to do a research one or education one, the interview is the same for all. They
yeah,
don't
so
ask different questions.
it's one standard interview for all people, right? But within your personal interview, so when it's about you personally, that's where you talk about the research, leadership, or med ed. So that's where you kind of specify what you're applying to yourself. But
Right. Okay.
the whole process otherwise is identical.
Right. Okay. And as well as the white space questions, that's where you would say what type of thing
Yeah,
you
so
want.
in the first question, you specify, research, leadership, or med ed.
Okay. Right.
Um,
Thank you.
I think someone asked if you, so critical appraisal. So the paper, you get it 5 minutes before you enter the station. So we had it basically where there were 3 stations. You sort of sit down, you get a clinical scenario, for example, for 5 minutes, you read it, and then you go in and answer the questions. Then you had a paper for 5 minutes, read it, went in and answered the questions. And you also get the actual paper in front of you when you answer the questions to the examiner. So you can annotate it, you can write some, a few remarks on that. But you do have access on the day just before the interview, as opposed to having it, months or days in advance. Are there any other questions? You guys can just shout out if you have any other questions or just general remarks. So I don't think it really matters. So the question is, if you prefer a research AFP and your white space questions are focused on research, but you also applied to med ed and leadership, do you have any? Yeah, you do. So I know someone who applied to the Northwest. She wanted research, but she only got the leadership one at Bolton, and she went and did that. So it doesn't really hamper your chances at all. So I think just put wherever you'd be happy going to really within that deanery and just going for it. It doesn't really disadvantage you in any way whatsoever. So it's just basically they're allocated based on how you performed. So if you did better than someone who's like specified leadership, you get to above them because you did better overall. So it's ranked based on your white space questions, your education achievement, and your interview. But I think basically the bulk of it is the interview. So if you get an interview, then if you perform really well, that will overcome any weaknesses in the white space questions or your papers or publications. Yeah, I think one station's been removed, so it's 2 stations now. I think that's been updated recently in the Northwest, so it probably makes it a bit easier for you guys. Any other questions? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So even if your white space questions are research focused, you can still get into the education AFP. So like I mentioned, I know someone who was very much research focused, but she didn't get that. And she got, I think it was leadership in the end, and she was happy with that because you can tailor any sort of project, into whatever you want to make it. You can mold it into whatever you want to be. And as Yasmin mentioned, you really can, I think basically once you're on, it's very flexible. And then once you're on F1, you can do whatever you want within that F1 year as well. So you don't have to do research, specifically in your F2 year on your AFP block. You can do research throughout the first year. So if you're really interested in research and you've got education, then you can do a lot of research in F1 and more education in F2. And then with the education, you can do education focus in that particular. So let's say ophthalmology is your interest. You can do education in ophthalmology as your research project. So you can basically manipulate things to how you want to manipulate it. I'm not sure what Sana Ali means. So in terms of accepting an offer, does that count before or after you list your preferences?
Sorry, yeah, that's me. I just mean like, how you were saying that once you accept your AFP offer, you get kind of taken off the FPAS scheme.
Yeah.
So if you got an offer, like, and obviously you have to don't you have to list all the AFP jobs in the order that you want them?
Yeah.
So like, does you being taken off the foundation program, does that happen before, like, as in which bit's the offer? Is it when you get the offer of the specific job, or just getting an offer of AFP?
So I think,
So I was just going to say, your offer will be a specific job. So you rank all the jobs that you want, and you will get an offer of a specific job, and that'll be one of the ones that you ranked. And then, literally, as soon as you accept that offer, you're automatically withdrawn from the foundation, and you'll get an email saying that you've been withdrawn from the normal foundation application program, and you'll get a confirmation that you've accepted your AFP offer. I don't know if that answers the question. Yeah, okay, fine.
No, it did. I was just freaking myself out a bit. Thanks.
I think someone asked, just to confirm, AFP application has no bearings. Yeah, so it has no bearings whatsoever on your normal foundation application. So they're two completely segregated, they have no bearing on each other, right? So your AFP is very much separate to your FP, separate to the foundation priority thing. So they're all very different things, and doesn't affect you whatsoever in that regard. The 200 word limit is quite restrictive. Yeah, so obviously the last white space question is specifically targeted towards your aspirations and your future career. I think just the point I was trying to make was that in each question, just link it back to how that particular experience is useful for the AFP. So for example, I did research and I gained useful skills in academic writing, which I want to bring onto the AFP and further enhance during the AFP program. So something like that. So just a brief 1 or 2, maybe 3 sentences maximum. And the last one is very much specifically targeted towards the academic background and the whole pathway from A to Z. So from AFP all the way to professorship. So 1 or 2 sentences. So trying to link it always back to the AFP, but not going into too much detail and saving that for the last white space question. I agree, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I think someone asked about if you're working on a research project, can you mention it? Absolutely, yeah. So that's really good. So if you haven't got a publication in anything, mention the white space questions, talk about it in your interview. You can milk as much as you want to. So just mention it wherever you can, especially if it's something that you're really passionate about and you want to go into as an AFP project itself. Yeah. And again, you don't have to have papers, like people always say, but it's true. You don't have to have papers or publications. Obviously it helps, but it's not necessary or fundamental to getting an offer. So don't stress too much about that. And you can say, I'm currently working on this particular project, which we hope to publish in the near future. It doesn't have to be true, but it could happen. So yeah, do you mention anything you can possibly mention that would maybe get you points?
Sorry, I'm not sure if you've seen this question. It was at 7:12 from Lizzie Baggers, who's asked, do you know whether Manchester tends to be more competitive than Liverpool, or vice versa once in the AUOA?
Manchester's the most competitive in the Northwest Deanery.
And there was one question above that, which is quite specific to Manchester, I think, which is, does European studies count as an extracurricular achievement?
I'll let Yasmin answer.
That's a good point, actually. It wouldn't really fit any of those criteria because it's not a prize. It's definitely something you can talk about at interviews if it comes up, but I don't think it would fit within those sections, if I'm being honest with you. Let me just have a look again. But yeah, I don't think so.
I think while she checks another question, so you don't need to aspire to be a professor to do the AFP, right? So you can use the AFP to see if it suits you or doesn't suit you. I think just mention it for the sake of getting points. But a lot of people, then go on to do sort of normal careers and sort of more leadership careers or whatever, or private work. And some who didn't do AFP then go into research. So you don't need to want to become a professor, but mentioning it as part of the broad view of your view of academic medicine gets you more points. So yes, mention that you then want to follow it on to professorship, but that doesn't necessarily have to be true, if that makes sense. So just I mentioned it, but I don't think I necessarily want to go on to do the ACF, for example.
Do you know whether masters in the arts count as additional degrees?
I think any master's really counts.
Yeah, any additional degree.
Any additional degree would count, yeah. is there any documents you recommend reading for the interview now for my white space questions? Are there any acceptance rates documents online? So I think the main thing that I did really personally, and let Yasmin answer as well, but I think personally I wrote my answers down as a first draft. I sent it to different people who work in academia. They sent it back to me. I modified it, sent it back, and they came back to me. And I think that was the best way to do things because they really improved the questions from what they were initially. And so I mentioned getting feedback from people who are either AFP at the moment or people who are sort of professors who work in sort of competitive applications, as in who judge them themselves, would really help you and put you in good stead. I think, like Yasmin mentioned, like every application is unique. So for example, like I can show you my white space questions, I don't mind, but my white space questions will be very different to what you can write in your white space questions. It's very, very different. So I think everyone's very unique. So looking at online examples, yes, it may help for like specific buzzwords, but I think everyone's very unique. So writing your own thing in your own time and then sending it off to professors and AFPs that you know, I think that's really the best way of getting about doing that. I don't know if you agree, Yasmin, or...
Yeah, definitely.
So there's a question about posters. So if you have an abstract from a poster with a PMID, but your name doesn't pop up on the PMID, can you still put it down? Thanks for the talk. So from my understanding, I don't know if you want to ask this question, Yasmin, because it's in your section.
Yeah, so essentially for it to count, they will... So an abstract from a poster that you're counting as a... Okay, with a PubMed ID, but your name doesn't pop up with a PubMed ID. No, so they'll to count it as a publication, they will need the PubMed ID to link directly to something with your name. So if it doesn't show that you're an author, they won't count it, unfortunately. But if you're not sure, I guess there's no harm in putting it down.
I think a general rule is that basically just put everything down. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah,
Like, you never mark down for anything. So just put everything down. I know someone, like, he presented this like very small thing at a hospital. It's like a local like presentation. It's nothing like official at all. He got marks for it. So I think just put anything down. They won't really know whether it's like local, national, or even a legit thing. So put anything down. You don't lose any marks and you may get some potential like additional bonus points. So put everything you can possibly think of down and then just hope for the best. I think that's really the best way to go about it.
Is that it, questions-wise? I hope I've not missed anything in the chat. Anyone's questions? I think we've covered everything, to be honest. But...
I think there's another one. If you have an international poster presentation, but it doesn't have a PMID, will you get the points? I think for
so yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
So posters count, right? You don't need a PMID for a poster to count. I think what Yasmin was saying, basically, if you want the abstract of that poster to count, like your name has to be there on a specific PMID reference point. But for a poster, it can be any poster anywhere. It doesn't have to have a specific reference to PubMed. It's just a poster, right? So that would count as a poster, but not as a research sort of publication.
Yeah, and you don't need to evidence that either. It's just the publication. If you want to, you want the publication of an abstract to count, that's when you need the PubMed ID, if you want it to count as a publication. Cool. I mean, we're happy to come back and do something specifically on interviews in the next few weeks. We have a feedback form that I think is, oh, there we go. Yeah, the link's in the chat. I think there should be a question at the end that just says if you want us to come back and talk about interviews. So make sure you fill in that feedback, and thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Brill, I don't know where Dan is.
Sorry, I've just unmuted myself now. I'm going to end the recording if it's not been stopped already.
Yeah.
I'm the one recording, but there's an event tomorrow evening on abstract appraisal. Because they've taken this off the Northwest, but this might be useful for those applying to other deaneries. It'll be on appraising abstract, and I've put the link in the chat.
Yeah, so following on from that, just to plug a few more of the events. So there's tomorrow's lecture, which Flea has just mentioned. And then also we're going to have another lecture in a week's time. I believe it's on November 2nd, which is dealing with statistics for the AFP. So they both go sort of hand in hand for the critiquing and abstract section. And then we are looking to do mock interviews as well. And because of the changes to the Northwest interview, we're not 100% sure about what format we'll be pursuing, but we will be holding the mock interviews. And if you're not in our AFP group, please just message us and let us know. It is only for Manchester students, but if you're not in it, please message our Facebook group and let us know.
That's really useful. Just to add, make sure you find a group to prepare for interviews with. It's really useful. You can bounce ideas off each other, and I think it makes a lot of difference, especially preparing for the medical stations.
Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. You're free to go.